Wyoming Territory, 1879, the wind rolled hard off the Bighorn Mountains, carrying dust and trouble into the town of Gray Bluff. Orin Prescott had just stepped off his buckskin mare when he heard the screaming. It came from the alley behind the saloon, sharp, panicked cries, followed by the unmistakable sound of fists hitting flesh. He dropped the reins, boots pounding the dirt as he dashed toward it. What he saw stopped his breath cold. A thin woman with tangled brown hair and a torn calico dress threw herself over two small children. Her arms were wrapped around them, her thin body shivering from the blows a man rained down on her. The man a drifter Orin had seen around town the last few days was shouting something slurred, swinging wildly. One of the children, a boy around 6, sobbed as he tried to push the man away, and the girl, maybe 4, just clung to her mother's back. Orin did not hesitate. He grabbed the drifter by the collar and yanked him backward, slamming him into the wall. The man staggered, fists ready, but when Orin pulled his Colt from his holster, the fight drained out of him fast. "You touch her again, I will put you in the ground," Orin said, voice low and hard. The drifter spat blood and stumbled off, muttering curses as he disappeared behind the mercantile. The woman had not moved. She stayed crouched over the children, whispering to them, her body trembling. Orin holstered his gun and stepped closer, careful not to scare her. "You're safe now," he said gently. She looked up at him, then her lips split, one eye already swelling. But it was the look in her eyes that struck him most. Not fear, not even pain, just a bone-deep weariness that settled in the bones like winter cold. "Come on," he said, reaching out a hand. "Let me help you." She hesitated, then took it. He led them to the livery, where he kept a small room over the stables. It was not much, but it was warm and private. The children stayed close to her legs, silent now. Orin laid out a blanket near the stove and poured water from the kettle. "I'm Orin Prescott," he said, crouching down to their level. "Do you have a name?" The woman nodded slowly. "Rowena Nash," she said hoarsely. "These are my children, Abigail and Amos." "How long's he been hurting you?" Orin asked, jaw tight. Rowena touched her lip, then the bruises on her arm. "Too long." Orin gave her a clean cloth and stepped back to give her space. "You got kin anywhere?" She shook her head. "No one. Their father died 5 winters ago. We left Kansas hoping to find work. That man, he offered a ride west. Said he had a place lined up for me, but he lied. Took our money. Then he started drinking." Orin's palms clenched. He looked at the children, both huddled together like pups trying to disappear. "You are not going back with him." Rowena looked up at him, startled. "I mean it," he said. She stared at him for a long moment, then gave a sharp nod. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet healing. Orin gave up his bed and slept in the loft with the horses. He brought food from the diner across the street and left it by the door. Rowena tended to the children, barely speaking, but Orin saw how she touched their hair, how she made them laugh in whispers when she thought no one was watching. He found himself watching her more than he meant to. On the 5th morning, he brought up a tin of biscuits and found her sitting at the window with a needle and thread, mending Amos's shirt. "You do not have to keep feeding us," she said softly. "I know," Orin said, setting the tin down. "I want to." She looked at him, then not the guarded glance she had given him before, but something more open. There was still pain in her eyes, but something warmer too, grateful, curious. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. "I do not like seeing good people hurt," he said simply. She blinked, then looked down, threading the needle again. "You do not even know if I am good." "I know enough," Orin said. Rowena did not answer, but her fingers stilled on the cloth and her cheeks flushed. That afternoon, Orin walked into town and found the sheriff near the general store. "You seen that drifter lately?" Orin asked. The sheriff, a broad man with a fading mustache, shook his head. Left town yesterday. Asked for a train ticket east. Heard about what happened. You did right, Orin. Man like that has no place here. When Orin returned to the stable, he found Amos sitting cross-legged by the door, holding a stick like a sword. "Are you a cowboy?" the boy asked. "I am," Orin said, kneeling beside him. "Why?" Amos looked up at him with wide eyes. "Mama says cowboys always ride away." Orin glanced toward the window. Rowena was inside, brushing Abigail's hair. "Well," he said, "not always." That night, as the fire crackled low, Rowena stepped outside while the children slept. She found Orin leaning against the fence, watching the stars. "The sky's bigger here," she said quietly. "It is," he agreed. She stood beside him, arms crossed against the chill. "I do not know how to repay you." "You do not have to," he said. Rowena looked at him, her face soft in the moonlight. "Most men would have walked away." "I could not," he said. "Not when I saw what he was doing to you." Her eyes welled, but she blinked them clear. "You saved us." He turned toward her. "He was hurting you. You were trying to protect your children. That matters." For a moment the world stilled. Then Rowena stepped closer. She reached out, brushing her fingers against his hand. "I do not know what comes next," she whispered. Orin looked down at her hand resting against his. "You do not have to know yet. Just stay." A long breath escaped her, and she nodded. He wrapped his arm lightly around her shoulder, and they stood there in silence as the wind rustled the grass, and the stars watched over them like old friends. Rowena stood at the wash basin, sleeves damp to the elbow, her hands red from scrubbing. A chipped bar of lye soap rested on the edge of the basin, its edges worn soft. Abigail sat on a stool nearby, sorting buttons into neat little piles, her lips moving silently as she counted. Amos lay curled near the stove, a wooden horse tucked beneath his chin. The room above the livery was close, but it had begun to feel less like a place borrowed and more like a place held. She wouldn't have said it aloud, not even to herself, but the hush in her shoulders told her something had shifted. They were breathing easier. When Orin returned from the rangeland that evening, dust on his boots and a battered canteen slung at his hip, he paused in the threshold. The lantern on the table cast a warm glow across the room. Abigail looked up from her buttons and offered him a small wave. Rowena watched him tip his hat in return and slide it onto the hook by the door. "You been out near the ridgeline?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron. "Drove a steer out of a ravine," he said, unlacing his gloves. "Found bones down there too, old ones, maybe from spring thaw." "You get much rest today?" "I tried," she said, leaning against the table. "But Amos had a nightmare, couldn't settle him after." Orin crouched by the boy, brushing a hand gently over his back. "He's sleeping deep now," she nodded. "He doesn't do well with quiet yet. Too used to listening for the next bad thing." He rose and looked at her, face thoughtful, and something in his gaze held steady. Not pity, something steadier than that. "I was thinking," he said. "There's a widow south of here, name of Mrs. Lang. Keeps a few goats, sells cheese and eggs through the mercantile. She's older, no family near. Could use help, she told me once." "You think she'd hire me?" Rowena asked, brows lifting. "I think she'd be glad for company as much as anything." "You'd be paid, and it's close enough you could walk it with the children come spring." Rowena pressed a hand to her chest. "You do that for me?" "No," he said. "Just pointing out a path that's already there. You decide if you want to take it." She looked down at the floorboards, then back up. "I'd like that. A place of our own, even if it's only a corner of someone else's." He nodded once. "Then I'll take you to meet her tomorrow." That night, she sat by the window long after the lantern burned low. The children lay tangled in quilts behind her, breathing soft. She didn't hear Orin approach until he stood beside her, his steps quiet against the wood. "The moon's near full," he said, resting a hand on the sill. She turned her face toward him, shadows softening the bruises that had begun to fade. "It used to scare me," she said. "How wide the world felt at night, like I could fall through it. Not anymore. I don't know. Maybe I've stopped falling." He didn't speak, didn't offer comfort where it wasn't asked for, just stood with her, shoulder close to hers, his presence anchoring as the wind brushed the eaves. After a long silence, she asked, "Were you ever married?" He shook his head. "Got close once, before the war." She didn't wait. Rowena studied his profile in the moonlight. "That must have hurt." "It did." He looked at her then, his voice quieter now, but she chose what she needed. "I can't fault her for that. I wouldn't have left," Rowena said, surprising herself. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low and certain. "I don't think you would have." The next morning they rode out together, the children bundled in scarves on the back of Orin's roan. The trail south curved past bare cottonwoods and a frozen creek bed, the hooves muffled in the frost-hardened earth. Abigail hummed to herself, chin tucked into Rowena's shoulder. Amos clutched the saddle horn with mittened hands, eyes wide at the open hills. "Mrs." Lang met them at the gate with a kerchief tied under her chin and a wary gaze. Her house was simple, a single-room cabin with whitewashed walls and a lean-to for the goats, but it was tidy, and the smoke from her chimney smelled of cedar. "You're the girl Orin brought in," she said, eyes narrowing. Rowena nodded. "I'm Rowena Nash. These are my children." The older woman studied her a moment longer, then nodded once. "I've a churn that needs fixing and a fence post loose out back. If you've a mind to work, I've a mind to feed you." Rowena straightened. "I don't take charity, Mrs." Lang huffed. "Good, I don't give it." By the time the sun leaned westward, Rowena had cleaned the hearth, stacked wood, and patched a torn curtain. Orin fixed the post with Amos watching close, asking questions about every nail. Abigail helped Mrs. Lang measure flour for biscuits, hands flour dusted and proud. When they mounted up again, Rowena turned in the saddle and looked back at the cabin. A goat bleated from the pen, and smoke curled steady from the chimney. "She offered me a corner of the loft and a place at her table," Rowena said, glancing sideways at Orin. He met her gaze. "You want it?" "I think I do." They rode in silence a while, the only sounds the creak of leather and the soft, steady breaths of the children. Then she said, "You've done more for us than anyone ever has." "I just gave you a place to land," he said. "You gave us more than that." He turned toward her, eyes steady. "I'd like to keep doing that if you'll let me." Rowena held his gaze. "I think I'd like that too." The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long gold light across the prairie. For the first time in years, the path ahead didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something they could walk together. The wind had softened by March, though snow still clung to the north-facing slopes. Mud pulled at boots and wagon wheels alike, but the days were stretching longer, and the earth beneath the thaw was beginning to breathe again. Rowena stood in the Lang pasture with her skirts tucked up past her ankles, sleeves rolled to the elbows. A new fence line was going in west of the goat pens. Her hands were blistered from the post-pounder, but she didn't mind the ache. Beside her, Abigail collected kindling in a basket while Amos crouched in the grass, studying a beetle dragging a twig twice its size. "You ever think about keeping your own land?" Orin asked as he set down a sack of feed beside the barn. His shirt was damp at the collar, and a fresh nick ran along his knuckle from the buckle he'd been fitting to a saddle strap earlier. Rowena rested the post-pounder against the fence rail. "I used to think about a lot of things." But thinking and doing were two different worlds back then. He nodded, brushing dirt from his palms. "They still are, but sometimes they edge close enough you can reach between them." She shaded her eyes and looked toward the far hills. "There's a plot just past the bend in the creek," she said. "Empty but for a broken chimney and a half-standing wall. I walked past it last week, thought maybe if I saved enough over summer." Orin didn't speak right away. He followed her gaze instead, the wind tugging gently at his shirt. That land used to belong to the Crawfords. Fire took the house 6 years back. No one's claimed it since. Rowena turned to him. "Would it be hard to file on it? Not if you've got the grit to hold it through the winter." He paused. "I'd help you with that." Her throat tightened and she looked away, pretending to study the edge of the pasture. "Thank you. I'm not offering out of kindness," he said quietly. "I'm offering because I want to build something with you." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It settled around them like a blanket pulled tight against the cold. "I've never had a man say that without expecting something in return," she said. "I'm not most men." She glanced down at her hand, fingers dirty and raw where the skin had cracked. "You take on all this. The children, the work, whatever I can't yet name. I'd take on you, all of you. Not because I pity what you've been through, but because I see who you are standing here." The wind quieted. A goat bleated in the distance. Abigail plucked a feather from the grass and tucked it behind her brother's ear, who didn't notice. Rowena stepped forward, slow and certain. "I can't promise I'll always know how to do this. I've lived too long braced against the next blow." "I'm not asking for promises," he said. "Just the chance to stay at your side." She reached out, laying her hand over his. It was rough, scarred from work and weather, but warm beneath her touch. "I'm not scared of the work, I just needed to know I wouldn't be doing it alone." "You won't be," Orin said. Later that evening, after the children had fallen asleep beneath the Lang loft's steep rafters, Rowena stepped outside and crossed the field. Orin was seated on the hitch rail, oiling his saddle. He looked up when she approached, and she didn't stop until she stood between his knees. She leaned down and kissed him slow, unsparing, full of breath and salt and earned quiet. His hand came up to her waist, hesitant only for a second before holding her steady. When she pulled back, she rested her forehead to his. "I want a home, not just walls and a roof. A place where they can grow and I can breathe. I want that with you." "You'll have it," he said, voice steady. They stayed like that until the lanterns in the house were doused and the moon climbed high above the ridge. The saddle sat forgotten on the rail, oil rag tossed aside. As two people who had once been strangers leaned into a life neither had dared to imagine. And in that quiet moment, with the scent of thawing earth and cedar smoke on the air, Rowena knew she'd stepped across a line she wouldn't be forced back from. Not by fear, not by memory, not by any man who thought he could take what she had reclaimed. She was no longer surviving. She was beginning. The creek behind the Lang property had begun to run again. Thin rivulets, cold and quick, cutting through the remains of snowbanks and gathering in low pools where frogs would come later in the season. Rowena stood knee-deep in the tall grass beyond the barn, her skirts damp and spotted with mud, a spade in her hand. She worked slowly, turning the softening earth with steady rhythm. She'd asked Mrs. Lang for a patch to plant root vegetables. Not out of necessity, though they could use the food, but because she needed to put something in the soil and watch it live. Orin approached from the fence line, saddle blanket draped over one shoulder, still smelling faintly of bay leaf and sweat. He paused where she worked, thumbs hooked into his belt. "The land agent's coming into Gray Bluff next week," he said. "Might be a good time." Rowena didn't stop digging. "You think he'll listen to a woman with no deed and 2 children? He'll listen if I'm standing beside you." She stabbed the spade into the dirt again. "I want to sign it myself." Orin's mouth pulled into a quiet line. "Then you will." She straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. "I've never signed anything that mattered. Not my marriage, not our passage west. Just watched men put my name where they pleased. This one'll be yours to place, he said. No one else's hand on it. Rowena looked at him, his face shaded beneath his hat brim. You always speak like truth is simple. It is, when you've lived the other side of it long enough. She studied him, the way he stood without reaching for her, without pushing. You ever think about leaving Wyoming once, he said. After the war, I rode south as far as Texas. Thought distance might fix me. Turns out it just made the quiet louder. Rowena set the spade aside. And now I've got reason to stay. She nodded slowly. I've never stayed anywhere by choice. Always felt the ground would give out beneath my feet. Then maybe it's time you stood somewhere solid. That evening, after supper, Rowena sat on the porch step with Amos nestled against her side. He'd worn through the toe of his right boot, and she was stitching a leather patch into place. Abigail was inside helping Mrs. Lang fold linens, her soft voice barely carrying through the open window. Orin came back from the paddock with his shirt sleeves damp to the elbow and a length of rope coiled over one shoulder. Dug a trench for the runoff, he said, settling beside her. Rowena didn't look up from her stitching. He's been quieter this week, she said, nodding to the boy. I think the nightmares are easing. Children feel things in their bones. They know when the danger's past. Her hand stilled. Has it? For good men, danger never disappears. But for you and the children, yes, it's past. She looked at him then, not with fear or hesitation, but with something steady. I've been trying to hold on to hope like it's something delicate, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's just something you choose, even when it feels foolish. Hope's not foolish, he said. It's what gets us through. She finished the last stitch and tied it off. I want to plant a garden when we settle on the land. Not because we need the food, but because I need to see something grow where nothing grew before. I'll build the fence around it, he said. Keep out the hares. She smiled then, small and sure. And we'll need a roof. One you don't have to duck under. I'll see to it. They sat in the fading light, the day cooling around them, the porch creaking beneath their weight. Amos drifted to sleep against her arm, his breath even. Orin reached out slowly, resting his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. There's a church in Gray Bluff, he said quietly. Not much white paint peeling, pews uneven, but the preacher's honest. If we decide to bind this thing between us proper. Rowena looked down at their joined hands, then back at him. I'd like that. When the land is ours. When the land is ours, he agreed. The stars were rising as they carried the children inside, one by one. Rowena tucked them beneath the quilts and watched their chests rise and fall in the hush of sleep. Orin waited for her by the door. When she joined him, he offered his arm and she took it. They stepped out into the night together, the field stretching wide before them, full of thaw and promise. The future no longer waited at the edge of some far-off place. It was here, in the dark earth beneath her nails, in the warmth of the hand she held, in the quiet strength of a man who had offered her not rescue, but return. And she was ready. The cabin had no door yet, just a wool blanket hung from the lintel, stirring with each breath of air. The chimney stood solid now, stones mortared by Orin's hand, and smoke curled from it for the first time in years. Inside, the floor was bare pine planks, rough but clean. The window panes caught the sunlight just enough to soften the edges of the room, and the scent of fresh sap clung to the beams like a promise. Rowena stepped back from the hearth, wiping her palms against her skirt. The stew she'd set to simmer was bubbling slow, and Abigail was arranging tin cups on the table, tongue between her teeth in concentration. Amos sat cross-legged by the wall, carving shallow notches into a scrap of cedar with one of the blunt knives Orin had dulled for him on purpose. Outside, the wind carried the scent of damp grass and turned soil. Orin worked on the chicken coop, hammer thudding slow and steady from the far side of the shed. He'd built the coop low, for Abigail's arms to reach the nests without standing on anything. Rowena had watched him measure the height with quiet care, pretending to be checking the slope of the roof while her daughter stood near, unaware of the attention. She stepped out, brushing her sleeves down and tying her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You'll need to shore that hinge with something thicker," she said, nodding toward the door flapping against the wind. Orin looked up from where he crouched. "I've got a strip of rawhide soaking. Should hold better than iron in this weather. I'll bring the nails then." He set the hammer down and wiped his brow with a bandana. "You always this quick to give orders." "I'm used to doing things myself," she said, handing him the small tin nail box. "Hard to unlearn." "I don't want you to unlearn it," he said, quiet but sure. "I just want you to know you don't have to anymore." She watched his hands as he lined up the hinge and drove the first nail through it. "I never thought I'd live somewhere that felt like mine." "You're not just living here," he said. "You're shaping it." The sun dipped low as they finished the hinge and checked the chicken wire. The coop was sturdy now, and the pen beside it had been raked clean. Rowena leaned against the fence rail and looked toward the field where the soil had been turned for planting. "Amos says he wants to raise a piglet." Orin chuckled, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. "I reckon we can manage that come fall. He said he'd name it after you." He blinked, then grinned. "Well, I'll try not to take that personal." She tilted her head, watching him with a warmth that had grown more certain each day. "I told him you'd be too stubborn for a pig." "You're not wrong." They walked back to the cabin together, the evening light thick with dust and gold, footsteps muffled in the soft grass. Inside, Amos had fallen asleep in front of the fire, and Abigail was curled in the rocking chair, her eyes half-lidded, humming a tune she must have picked up from Mrs. Lang. Later, after the children had been settled beneath quilts, Rowena stepped outside again. The stars were just beginning to pierce the sky, and the air held that stillness that only came when the world had truly gone quiet. Orin stood on the porch, arms folded, staring out at the ridge. "You told me once you rode south after the war," she said. "Did you find anything worth keeping down there?" He didn't turn. "Nothing that held." She stepped closer. "And now," he turned to her then, slow, as if he'd been waiting. "Now I've got a roof I built with my own hands. A fire I want to come home to." She stepped into him, resting her hand against his chest. "I haven't said it yet, not out loud." "You don't have to," he said, but his voice was soft. "I want to." He waited. She reached up, fingers brushing his jaw. "I love you, Orin Prescott, not for saving me. Not for the land or the home. But because when everything fell apart, you didn't try to fix me. You just stood beside me until I could stand on my own." He pulled her close then, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that wrapped around her like the wind through tall grass. His mouth found hers, and the kiss was deep, warm, unhurried, the kind that settled into the bones and stayed there. They married before the summer was out, beneath the cottonwoods near the creek. Mrs. Lang brought bread and a jar of peach preserves. The preacher's wife played a hymn on a cracked fiddle, and the children scattered wildflowers along the path. Rowena wore a dress dyed with walnut husks and sewed the hem herself. Orin had shaved for the first time in weeks, and when he took her hand, his eyes didn't waver. They spoke no vows beyond what was needed. Their promises had already been lived, day by day, in the way he warmed water for her bath without being asked, in the way she mended his shirts before he noticed the tears. The garden bloomed with carrots and peas. The piglet came in September, and Rowena let Amos name it after Orin after all. Abigail learned to read from the old primer Mrs. Lang passed down, and by winter, She was teaching her brother letters by the firelight. And when the snows came, laying quiet over the land they had claimed, Rowena stood at the window of their cabin and watched Orin lift Amos onto his shoulders to hang pine boughs above the door. She turned back to the fire, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and felt no fear of the cold or the quiet. She had walked through ruin and come out holding something whole. And this time, it was hers to keep.